They called him Don Carlos, but he was never truly a Don, and never truly Carlos. He was not a man who lived, but a boy who decayed, a promise that curdled into a warning, a royal heir who became a royal horror. Spain remembers him as a whisper behind palace walls, a shadow in a velvet hallway, a scream muffled behind a curtain. And yet, in his time, he was everything: prince, project, possession. The only child of Philip II and Maria of Portugal, born not out of love, but strategy, a marriage to unite the thrones of Spain and Portugal, forged in duty, sealed in blood, and perhaps doomed from the moment it was spoken. If you believe that behind every crown lies a curse, subscribe to our channel, where history bleeds through silence. Don Carlos entered the world not with a cry, but with complications. His mother, only 16, died within days of delivering him. And from that moment, the boy was no longer a son. He was a relic of suffering, the child of a ghost. He was raised not by a mother's arms, but by priests, tutors, and shadows. They called him precious, but they handled him like glass, as if they knew. There were signs, subtle at first, a strange shape to the skull, eyes that didn't follow light, an odd gait. But the priests prayed louder, the physicians whispered less. The court needed an heir, and so he was one. Deformities were dressed in brocade, tremors were hidden behind royal gloves. But a malformed body is harder to hide than a malformed truth, and Don Carlos was both. His tutors struggled to teach him, not because he wouldn't learn, but because he couldn't. He showed moments of brilliance, yes, but they came like lightning, sudden, violent, and gone. He'd memorize scripture, then try to eat the page. He'd recite Latin poetry and follow it with animal cruelty. One day he caressed a dove. The next he tore it open with his hands. And yet the court smiled, painted portraits of a boy full of promise. All angles softened, eyes corrected. Spain needed the illusion. Philip needed it most. The king who ruled with iron faith could not accept that his only son was a cracked vessel. So he poured more into him. More tutors, more sermons, more discipline, as if devotion could repair what breeding had broken. But this was no ordinary misfortune. This was inheritance made visible. His skull bore the imprint of generations folded into themselves. Habsburg jaw, Bourbon brow, and something else. Something twisted, unnameable. His blood was a whisper of too many cousins, too few boundaries. His mind was its echo, and the throne, silent, ancient, watching, waited. As Don Carlos grew, so did the rumors. Servants spoke of screams in the night, of shattered mirrors, of a prince who lashed out at shadows and whispered to bones. He had no friends, only handlers. His rage was not childlike, it was imperial. When he struck, he did so with the confidence of someone who believed he could not be punished. And he wasn't, not truly. Who could discipline the future king? One day, he pushed a servant down the stairs for looking at him too long. The boy died. Don Carlos was confined for a week, then given a new tutor. Another time, he tried to set fire to the stables. They blamed youthful passion, but there was no passion in his acts, only calculation wrapped in madness, like a creature testing the limits of its leash. Behind closed doors, Philip watched his son with a growing silence. The king who had once ruled half the known world found himself unable to govern the boy who bore his name. Spain could not afford a mad heir, but faith forbade the thought of replacing him. So Philip tried again. Not as a father, but as a sovereign. He changed tutors. He prayed harder. He consulted confessors and inquisitors alike. They prescribed bloodletting, cold baths, isolation, fasting, the treatments of a dying age inflicted on a boy who was already unraveling. And still, he worsened. One physician noted in secret, "His Highness walks with the gait of a marionette and the eyes of one who sees only fire." Another wrote, more bluntly, "The prince is afflicted with a darkness from which no light escapes." And yet, in public, the image held a prince riding beside his father during processions, a royal smile, practiced in mirrors, stretched across a skull that throbbed beneath the crown. They dressed him in gold and lied in silk, but the people knew, they always do. The whispers spread, that the air was cursed, that the Habsburg bloodline had turned inward, like a snake devouring its own spine, that no good could come from a child born of so much silence and so little love. The throne loomed over him, not as a promise, but as a weight. He grew into his deformities the way a tree grows into a wall, warped, stubborn, and cracking at the edges. His limbs lengthened but lacked control. His voice deepened but carried no clarity. His face, once angelic in the lies of portraiture, twisted into something sharper, unsteady. And still they called him Don. Still they said, "One day, he will rule. He will." But he had already begun ruling in his own way, through terror. Servants no longer looked him in the eye. Maids left food outside his door and ran before it opened. Animals, once brought for his amusement, were kept away. The royal hounds feared him. The horses knew something was wrong. And his mind, it spun faster than the doctors could follow. Delusions crept in, first like dreams, then like commandments. He believed he was being poisoned, that his father meant to kill him, that the Pope had cursed him at birth. He locked himself in rooms for days, then emerged screaming about shadows. He covered mirrors with velvet and accused the reflections of spying. At night, he stabbed his mattress to drive out the demons. Philip watched, not as a father, but as a sovereign condemned to choose between kingdom and kin. There was one moment, brief, terrifying, when Don Carlos begged for a blade, not to end his life, but to cut out the rot. "It's inside me," he whispered. According to a court scribe, it eats from the center. I feel it move. When denied, he tried to drive a dagger into his own foot, to let the poison out. The court called it hysteria. The king called it shame. By now, even his allies had begun to retreat. The nobles who once courted his favor turned their backs. The clergy who once laid hands in blessing now crossed themselves in silence. The doctors, those silent witnesses to royal decay, knew the truth, but only in whispers. To name the illness was to name the bloodline. So Philip did what kings have always done when heirs turn monstrous. He planned, quietly, painfully, with all the weight of a man who once ruled continents, but could not save his own son from himself. He summoned the Council of Castile in secret. He requested reports from physicians, priests, and court advisors. One phrase returned again and again, unfit for rule. But in Spain, that was not merely a diagnosis. It was heresy against the divine right. To disinherit Don Carlos was to question God's plan. And yet, what choice remained? In 1568, the breaking point came. A plot, real or imagined, was uncovered. Don Carlos, now convinced that his father would kill him before crowning him, allegedly sought to flee to Flanders and raise a rebellion. The evidence was thin, contradictory, based mostly on intercepted letters and the whispers of terrified attendants. But Philip saw in it his opportunity. He acted not as a grieving father, but as an emperor executing law. On the night of January 18th, the palace walls closed in. A royal guard, handpicked by Philip, stormed the prince's chamber. Don Carlos fought, screamed, bit, but he was sedated, restrained, and imprisoned in his own quarters. The door was sealed from the outside. Food passed through a slit. No visitors were allowed. The heir to the Spanish throne had become its most dangerous prisoner, and Spain watched in stunned silence. Rumors multiplied that he had gone mad, that he'd been possessed, that the king had locked him away to hide a crime, that he was dead already, and the imprisonment was a lie to buy time for the succession to be rewritten. The court offered no answers. The priest said nothing. The king remained cloaked in divine authority. Inside his cell, Don Carlos deteriorated. He refused food, then demanded feasts. He shouted hymns at the ceiling, then tore holy books apart with his teeth. He wept for his mother, whom he had never known. He cursed Philip with the fury of a betrayed child and the cunning of a born conspirator. Some said he tried to starve himself. Others claimed he hurled himself against the stone walls, trying to split his skull. His weight dropped, his voice cracked. The walls echoed with sobbing, then silence. He lived like this for 6 months. And then, on July 24th, 1568, he died. The official cause: natural illness, fever, decline. The truth: a soul devoured by a body that should never have existed. A prince swallowed whole by the blood that made him. A throne that chewed on its future until only bone remained. No funeral procession was held. No royal mourning announced. His name was struck from records, his image erased from frescoes. The line moved on, as it always does. Spain had lost a son, but perhaps it had saved a kingdom. The rot, however, was never truly buried. The death of Don Carlos left no vacuum, only silence. A silence that crept like mold through the gilded halls of El Escorial. The same walls that once echoed with his tantrums, his erratic laughter, his threats, now held their breath. Spain did not weep, it exhaled. But silence is not the same as peace. And a buried prince is not the same as a forgotten one. Outside the palace, the people whispered of murder. Some said Philip had ordered poison, delivered by the same priests who blessed the boy's birth. Others claimed the king had slowly starved him, walling him in with scripture and fear. The most persistent tale, passed from kitchen to carriage, was that Don Carlos had been bled dry, one vein at a time, as punishment and purification. None of it was confirmed, and that, perhaps, was the most damning part. The truth was guarded more fiercely than any border, because the truth was not about one boy. It was about a family, a dynasty, a throne so terrified of its own reflection that it crushed the mirror and swept the shards beneath a velvet rug. Philip II, for all his piety, never again spoke his son's name aloud, but he kept the door to Carlos's chambers sealed, not dismantled, not repurposed, sealed, as if fearing that whatever festered within might one day seep out again. The room became legend. Servants avoided it. Ministers passed it with a glance downward. Some swore, on sleepless nights, they heard footsteps inside, or humming, or scratching. The rot of Don Carlos was never just his own. It belonged to Spain, because Carlos was not merely a broken child. He was the culmination of a dynasty that mistook blood purity for strength. He was the echo of cousin after cousin, uncle after niece, ceremony after ceremony where love was irrelevant and genetics were a tool. The Habsburgs had crafted themselves into myth, and Carlos was what happened when the myth began to eat itself. His deformities were never truly private. His madness could not be hidden behind robes and rituals. He was a truth too ugly to be painted over. And yet, in death, they tried. The court commissioned new portraits of the royal family. Carlos absent. His face was removed from tapestries. His name vanished from succession documents. But Spain remembered. The people carried his legend like a wound, a tale told in hushed tones, a warning whispered from generation to generation. Beware the blood that turns inward. Beware the throne that swallows its own. Philip, meanwhile, doubled down. In the years that followed, he became more devout, more severe, more convinced than ever that his reign was sanctified by God, and therefore unquestionable. He built El Escorial into a monument of austere grandeur, a monastery palace hybrid where silence reigned and penance became architecture. But beneath its marble and gold, something festered, a quiet rot that no incense could cover. The king would stare for hours at the crucifix in his chamber. They said he prayed, but others believed he was bargaining. With whom? No one dared ask. Not even the priests. He had given everything to God, his empire, his wars, his son. And yet the ghosts remained. In time, Spain's empire began to falter. Not with explosions, but with slow decay. Its colonies strained under the weight of royal arrogance. Its people starved as gold from the New World was funneled into holy wars and palatial tombs. And in the quiet corridors of power, men who had once bowed to Don Carlos's madness now schemed to ensure nothing like him could rise again. But bloodlines do not forget. Don Carlos had been the first undeniable warning, but not the last. The rot, masked for generations by ceremony and superstition, would return. In cousins born with jaws too heavy to speak, in princes too sickly to walk, in queens who bore children that never breathed. Each time the court invented new words for old curses: delicate constitution, melancholia, pious suffering. But the truth was older than language. You cannot twist blood into a crown without consequence. You cannot feed a throne your sons and expect it to stop eating. Years passed, and Don Carlos became more ghost than man. His story slipped into myth, half horror, half warning. For those outside the palace, he was the mad prince locked away for crimes unspeakable. For those within, he was the memory that still lingered in tapestries where his figure had been cut out, in the portraits with faces painted over, in the gaps of succession lines that no one dared name. But for Philip, he was something else entirely. He was guilt, the kind that clings not to the skin, but to the soul. No confession ever truly lifted it. No rosary ever truly dulled it. The king who presided over the most powerful empire in the world had lost the one thing he could never replace: an heir shaped in his own image, a legacy now rotting inside a sealed chamber. It was said that in his final years, Philip ordered the room reopened once, only once. He entered alone. No guards, no scribes, just silence and stone. When he emerged hours later, he said nothing, but he walked slower after that, prayed louder, wept in private, where only God, and perhaps the boy's ghost, could see. Historians still argue about what truly killed Don Carlos. Was it genetic collapse? Was it madness born from isolation and inbreeding? Was it the weight of a crown he was never fit to wear? But they missed the point. Don Carlos didn't die on July 24th, 1568. He had been dying since birth. From the moment he drew breath, he was the product of a system that prized purity over possibility, appearance over mercy. His body was not broken by accident. It was designed by generations of calculated incest. His mind wasn't shaped by chance. It was carved by expectation, suffocation, and fear. The throne never wanted a boy. It wanted a symbol, a vessel, and when that vessel cracked, it turned on him. Even now, centuries later, his name summons unease. It is not spoken in Spanish textbooks as often as other kings and queens. It lurks in the margins, a tale too shameful for national pride, too haunting for bedtime history. And yet, Don Carlos matters. Not because he ruled, he didn't. Not because he triumphed, he never did. But because his ruin is the perfect reflection of an empire convinced of its own righteousness. So convinced, it consumed its future just to protect its past. There are letters, still, locked in archives across Europe, notes from ambassadors, whispers from foreign courts, fragments of testimonies left by doctors and scribes too frightened to sign their names. Together, they form the outline of a life both royal and ruined, a puzzle made of scars and secrets. One fragment reads, "He asked me once why the stars looked broken. I told him it was the glass of the window, but he shook his head. No, he said, it's not the glass. It's the sky. It's cracked, like me." Another, "I have tended to prisoners. I have cared for the wounded. But never have I seen a soul so lost inside its own body." And one more, "The prince did not belong to the world. He belonged to history, a history that eats its children." Don Carlos's tomb is modest by royal standards. A slab of stone, a name carved in Latin, no monument, no marble angels, just the earth and silence. But sometimes that is the loudest memorial, because the silence around his story is not absence, it is shame. Spain moved on. The empire persisted for a time. But cracks had already formed. Cracks not just in palaces and policies, but in blood. The Habsburgs would go on to birth more kings, more queens, more fragile heirs with eyes too wide and jaws too tight. The same cycle, the same delusion, until finally, centuries later, the line collapsed under the weight of its own fear. And still, we look back. Still, we ask, what went wrong? But the answer was never hidden. It was sealed in a boy's bedroom. It was written in bone, stitched in blood, whispered from dying lips to deaf courts. The throne that devours its heir does not deserve to survive. Centuries later, tourists walk the cold stone corridors of El Escorial, tracing the footsteps of kings. They come for the grandeur, the symmetry, the weight of empire carved into every inch of its solemn facade. But they do not know, cannot know, that somewhere behind the thick walls, the memory of Don Carlos still lingers like mildew in an old chapel. They pass through the Hall of Battles, the Basilica, the royal pantheon beneath the earth where the bones of emperors sleep in gilded sarcophagi. They see the tomb of Philip II, the architect of empire and silence, lying among kings as though his reign had been clean, divine, righteous. Few ask where his son lies. Fewer still are told the truth. Because truth in this palace is buried deeper than bone. Don Carlos's story is not one of failure. It is one of sacrifice. Not noble, not willing, but ritualistic. He was not born to rule. He was born to absorb the sins of a system built on incest, on image, on unshakable control. His suffering was not an accident. It was a consequence. One the throne accepted without flinching. This is the hidden horror of monarchy, that it does not simply demand loyalty or blood or obedience. It demands distortion. And the more pure the bloodline, the more grotesque the shape it takes. Carlos was not a madman. He was the mirror held too close, the secret no crown once revealed. Even today, in history books, he is reduced to footnotes: a troubled boy, an unfortunate prince, a cautionary tale. But that, too, is a lie. He was not unfortunate. He was forsaken. The Spain of Philip's day could conquer oceans, burn heretics, and raise cathedrals high enough to reach heaven. But it could not face the monster it made in its own image. So it buried him, not just beneath stone, but beneath narrative. That's the real rot of power. Not the madness in a boy's mind, but the refusal to name it, the refusal to change, the need to preserve the image, no matter the cost, even if it costs a child his life, even if it costs an empire its future. And still, the cycle continues. Different crowns, different palaces, but the same story. Children shaped into symbols, symbols breaking beneath the weight, history erasing them in favor of cleaner lines and safer myths. But sometimes the ghosts return. Sometimes late at night, when all the candles have gone out and the silence returns to stone, the story of Don Carlos rises from its grave, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with a whisper that says, I was real, I was here, and I was eaten from the inside. If you believe that behind every crown lies a curse, subscribe to our channel, where history bleeds through silence.